much, Tamara, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Just one word, you mentioned the word esoteric.
Yeah.
We use this word in the sense Roman Rostolsky has introduced it in the Marxist tradition or theory, and he said Roman Rostolsky in the 60s when he made a relecture of the Grundrisse, he said there is an exoteric Marx and an esoteric Marx, and exoteric Marx is what we understand normally under Marxism, which is to read Marx as a theoretical of class struggle, of class domination. And what Roman Rostolsky calls the esoteric Marx is the Marx that points to the abstract domination in capitalism, the fetishism of commodity, abstract domination where the relations of people, of human beings, again like a separate force and dominate them. People is dominated by their own social relations in a reified form. And well, this is exactly the tradition where we stand in, and Krisis group or Krisis group, like to say in English, is a group that, well, you mentioned the Manifesto against Labor, which is one, I think is the text, the best known text of our production, but it's a very short text, a polemic text. We have a magazine called Krisis, where we publish a lot of texts, theoretical texts. We're a group of non-academic theorists working out of universities and outside of universities, and trying to accumulate a critique of capitalist society in more or less this way. You mentioned, I tried to sketch it out. Well, maybe this will be clearer after my speech, I hope so. I'll talk about the crisis of labor and the limits of capitalist society. And there will be some abstract concepts, I fear, I'm afraid. But I try to make it clear what the crisis of labor, which is not a new crisis. The crisis of labor is, in our point of view, started in the 70s and still goes on, the modern crisis of labor. And I try to explain what is the precourse going on of this crisis, how this crisis goes on, and how this affects on the relations of labor or on labor and society, and for most of us who depend on selling our labor force. I start with a empirical example. Last November, the Siemens CEO, Joe Kaeser, announced that his company, the well-known transnational company Siemens, was going to cut some 7,000 jobs worldwide and close several production sites in Germany. And this triggered, predictably, fierce protest and criticism. People ask, why are they making cuts while the company makes high profits? There was the well-known grievance that came from all sides, saying, here is a company again submitting to the dictates of the financial markets and the shareholders, and the honest work that make the company successful in the first place does not count anymore. There was some liberal-minded journalists that worried about what this action of Siemens CEO would cause and effects in the discourse, the public discourse, and there was this writer called Detlef Espinger, it's just an example, and he wrote in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, if you want is for people to ultimately grow exasperated with the market economy, capitalism and globalization, then you have to act like Käse and Company. They are fostering the worst cliches about gluttons who never are satisfied that the stock market rates are high enough. Well, in fact, the Siemens case highlights the status of labor, as well as the power relations between labor and capital in the current era of global capitalist system. Obviously, the dynamics of capital accumulation have shifted towards the financial markets over the last 3 decades, and this had drastic consequences for living and working conditions in society. But that is not due to the greed of any globally acting managers, bankers and investors. There are structural reasons that can explain, or that can be explained by the objectified historical dynamics of capitalist society. And in order to understand how labor has been increasingly degraded over the last 3 decades, we must therefore look more closely at these historical dynamics first. I want to state in advance that the historical dynamics underlying capitalist society have a historically specific character. Thus, I'm not referring to a transhistorical logic of social development as traditional Marxism would have it. Instead, I'm referring to a dynamic that is the product of an internal contradiction in capitalist society and therefore applicable to that society only. It's historically specific. The first moment of this contradiction is the compulsion to relentless accumulation of capital. What is capital? Capital is nothing more than value that must be valorized, which is to say, it must be augmented. Value empirically takes the form of money, and in that sense, its valorization can be illustrated in Marx's famous formula MCM prime, which means money, commodity, more money. This is a circle which is repeating constantly, and because it is a circle, we can call this an end in itself motion, because the same thing is at the beginning and the end of this endless augmentation loop. Money is turned in more money. Yes, this is a compulsion of capitalism. Capitalist accumulation means no other thing than money must be transformed in more money. So value, in the form of money, therefore again and again refers to itself alone. End in itself movement, as I said, and the sole objective of this movement is the constant accumulation of surplus value. By its own internal logic, this end in itself motion does not recognize any limits. Because of its purely abstract quantitative nature, it must in principle continue endlessly. And that is the basis for the incessant drive for growth in capitalist society. Yes, we always talk about growth and more jobs, and any political party or any government says we will provide more growth, maybe green growth by green technologies, but growth. This is the religion for everybody in capitalist society. And what is behind this growth imperative? It's just this end in itself movement, that value must be transformed in more value. That's the movement that moves, or that is the end in itself that moves capitalism. And this goes on although we all know that this will destroy the basis of human existence on Earth. We all know this. There is no endless growth possible, but it goes on. And it goes on although everybody talks about we must regulate it, we must stop it, we must take care of the natural resources. Well, we're talking about this at least the last 40 years. Nothing happens. Nothing substantially happens. Some things happen. Why does this go on? Because we have this basic compulsion which is internal to capitalist society, the imperative of continuous accumulation of capital expressed in the compulsion for growth. Well, this drive, that's one moment of this contradiction I was talking about. This drive toward incessant accumulation of capital now confronts a second moment in this contradiction, and that is the compulsion to constantly develop productive power, or as we say these days, increasing productivity. This compulsion, permanently increasing productivity, which is produced by the competition between the individual capitals. If one capital does not produce as productive as the other, well, it will be kicked off the market. So the competition between the individual capitals is a force that keeps on this compulsion. Productivity must be raised constantly. What does it mean for the value production? It means that the valorization of value cannot go on in the same way as before, because increasing productivity always leads to a reduction in the expenditure of labor per commodity. There are produced more commodities with less labor, and each commodity represents always a smaller share of value. This is because value is not valorized in a vacuum, but rather is based on the fact that labor power is expended in the production of commodities. Capital acquires labor power in order to apply to the production of commodities and skim the added value which is possible because the reproduction of labor power costs less than the surplus value it produces during working hours. If the expenditure of labor per commodity is therefore reduced due to the increased productivity, then the share of value represented by each commodity also decreases. And that represents a tendency that opposes the end in itself motion of capital valorization, which only can go on if more value is constantly produced. Now, that's a contradiction because on the one side, capital accumulation needs to produce every time more value, and on the other side, the even higher productivity in each period reduces value. So this is an internal contradiction which is basic to capitalist production. Well, but from a historical perspective, this inherent contradiction in the logic of capitalistic dynamics has been no obstacle to the valorization of capital. The effects of productivity have been compensated and overcompensated by accelerated expansion into new markets and development of new manufacturing sectors for mass production. The reduction in the value of individual commodities has thus been offset by accelerated overall growth. Every commodity represents a smaller amount of value, but if you produce more and more commodities, you can compensate this on the level of the system as a whole. Well, this dynamic took on particular force during the short era of Fordism, particularly during the roughly 30 years after World War II. In the capitalist centers, that period is regarded as a kind of golden age because it was the first time the wage-dependent majority of the population was able to participate in capitalist wealth in a significant way. But that era, which now is romanticized in hindsight, this era came to an end in the midst of 1970s when the Fordist boom reached its limits and a new productivity boost began, this time based on the new information and communication technologies. We call it the third industrial revolution. This third industrial revolution represents a qualitative break in the history of productivity growth. Why? It's a qualitative break because microelectronics facilitated a radical reorganization in production, overall such that labor lost the central importance that it previously had, and knowledge, or more precisely, the application of knowledge to production, became the main productive force. We all talk about the knowledge side. It's in a certain way expresses this point. Labor in former times was the central productive force in production. Now it's knowledge. So labor force is not needed in the same way it was before, at least in industrial production. But this upheaval had devastating consequences for capital valorization. With a massive displacement of labor from production, the source of surplus value, which had previously fueled the end in itself motion of valorization of value, dried up. This is empirically demonstrable in the fact that global material production output, the mass of produced commodities, has increased many times over since the 1980s, while the number of workers in the core centers of global market production, of the industrial production, has declined considerably during the same period. The development of new manufacturing sectors for mass consumption, like smartphones and computers, all those, has done nothing to change that because they have been organized on the terms of process automation. As a result, the world has been drowning in a rapidly growing flood of commodities, leading to an accelerated destruction of natural resources, but they represent an increasingly declining amount of value because they can be produced with less and less labor power. That is why the crisis of Fordism grew into a fundamental crisis of capital valorization that could no longer be resolved in the same way that previous major crises had been in the history of capitalism. The development of new growth eras for the application of labor power to commodity production was and is no longer possible at the existing level of production. Even the Keynesian methods of business revival, as they were applied everywhere in the 1970s, came to nothing and only led to a bubble in the national debt because they were not able to fix the structural causes of the crisis. As a result, classical capitalism, as we call it, reached a historical limit that it could no longer overcome in the 1980s. So we have this fundamental crisis in the 1970s, and in the 1980s we had this long crisis of Fordism, crisis of work, very broad discussion about future of labor, future work, similar to what we're discussing here now. And there seemed to be no solution, but there was a solution. After several attempts, another way out of the crisis of capital valorization emerged. The capital that could no longer be sufficiently invested in the so-called real economy, producing things, evaded to the financial markets on a grand scale. Thus, capital resumed its end in itself motion of augmenting money. However, this was no longer based on the application of labor to production of commodities, but rather on the accumulation of fictitious capital. Since this form of capital accumulation has determined the trajectory of capitalist society since then, and that implies that labor has lost its previous status in the dynamics of capitalism. I explain this a little better now. To understand what this means for labor and society, we must first ask what constitutes a specific character of the accumulation of fictitious capital, and how does it differ from capital valorization through the application of labor to the production of commodities. The concept of fictitious capital comes from Marx's Critique of Political Economy, but it was only developed in fragments there in volume 3 of Capital. In our book, Die große Entwertung, the Great Devalorization, would be the title in English, my colleague Ernst Lohoff and I draw on these fragments and attempt to develop them and make them useful for an analysis of the contemporary crisis of capitalism. The essential points can be summarized as follows. Fictitious capital arises whenever someone gives money to someone else in exchange for a title of ownership, a bond, a share in a company, etc., that represent a claim to that money and its augmentation in the form of interest or dividends, for example. This process doubles the original sum. Now this money exists twice and can be used by both parties. The recipient can use the money to buy things, make investments, or acquire financial assets. Yet at the same time, it has become monetary capital that yields a profit for the one who gave the money in the first place. I give the money, I receive a title, and we have doubled the money. Capital thus is augmented by the simple act of issuing a financial title. To put it in another way, capital has been accumulated even though nothing had been produced. But this monetary capital consists of nothing more than a documented claim representing the anticipation of future value. Whether or not this anticipation is covered by value production only becomes clear in retrospect. Anticipation of future value in the form of fictitious capital is a standard feature of capitalism. But it took on a completely different meaning over the course of the crisis in the wake of the Third Industrial Revolution. If the creation of fictitious capital once served to flank and support the process of capital valorization, for example, pre-financing large investments, now those roles have reversed because the basis for the process has fallen away. Capital accumulation is no longer significantly based on the exploitation of labor in the production of commodities, like cars and hamburgers and smartphones, but on the massive issue of property titles, like shares, bonds, etc. As a result, fictitious capital itself has become the engine of capital accumulation, while the production of commodities has been reduced to a dependent variable. First we had the engine of capital accumulation in the production section, now we have it in the financial sector. Of course, there is a critical distinction between this form of capital accumulation and the prior form of capitalist motion. Because it is based on the anticipation of value to be created in the future, it is a process of capital accumulation without capital valorization. It is not based on the present exploitation of labor power in the process of producing value, but on the expectation of future profits, which must ultimately be derived from additional exploitation of labor, supposedly. But because this anticipation cannot be redeemed in light of the development of productive power, this claim must be renewed again and again, and the anticipation of future value must be postponed further and further into the future. As a result, the financial titles are subject to an exponential growth imperative. That is why the value of capital consisting of financial assets surpassed that of manufactured and traded commodities many times over long ago. I think you know these relations that are drawn. We have more than 95% of financial titles volumes and just 5% of produced commodities and services. These runaway financial markets are often criticized in public opinion as causing the crisis, but in fact, once the basis for valorization was lost, this was the only way for capital accumulation to continue at all. So the financial markets are not the cause of the crisis, but an effect of the crisis. The crisis is more fundamental, it's a crisis of valorization, and the financial markets are, in effect, this crisis, a prolongation of this crisis, which is much more fundamental. That is why we refer in our book to the era of inverse capitalism in order to delineate the current period from classical capitalism, which was based on the application of labor to commodity production. Well, the dominance of finance industry accumulation does not mean that capital accumulation has been completely delinked from the real economy. In its way, capital accumulation in the finance industry always refers to certain reference points in the real economy. It does not assume that any valorization has happened in advance, but it does anticipate profit in the future. It is therefore dependent of hopes and expectation of future profit increases on the commodity market. These hopes, I'll explain this later. For example, every real estate boom is based on the prospect of increasing real estate prices, and every rise in the market prices is set in motion by hope of future corporate profits. The specific crisis vulnerability of the era of fictitious capital can be explained by this fictitious capital's dependence on profit expectations in the real economy. Whenever those forecasts turn out to be illusions and speculative bubbles burst, the accumulated fictitious capital loses its validity and the dynamics of accumulation stops. As most recently occurred during the global crisis of 2007-2008, in such a situation, the economy is threatened with a downward spiral of devalorization in which the suppressed fundamental crisis becomes manifest. This is why governments and central banks made all these interventions in the market to prevent the world economy to crash down. There is only one way to prevent this, and this is by creating new and even larger amounts of fictitious capital, whose accumulation is set by profit expectations in other areas of the real economy. After every crisis, governments talk about we will regulate financial markets, we will stop the speculation, and of course it doesn't happen. And this does not happen because they cannot stop this structural motion. And the only way to continue capitalist accumulation in the era we are living now is to continue accumulating fictitious capital on the markets. Well, I will not go into further details about the fictitious capital, but just look at the consequences for labor and for the mass of people who rely on the sale of their labor power. In the first place, we can say from an economic perspective, labor experiences a fundamental loss of significance for capital when capital is no longer significantly augmented through the exploitation of labor power in the production of commodities and by appropriating the corresponding surplus value, but rather refers directly to itself. When capital in the form of titles of ownership is sold as a commodity and the original capital is doubled in the course of that sale, that's what I explained, they give the money to someone and they receive the title and the capital is doubled in this moment, then the capital fetish has reached its ideal form. The movement, money, commodity, more money and prime becomes to a movement or turns to be a movement, money, more money, no commodity between. This movement is a movement in which the capital augments itself without its inconvenient detour through commodity production. But this clips the capital accumulation direct connection with the world of material goods and services. That production of material goods was always a means for the reproduction of money. So it was not the end of capital production to produce goods, but producing goods was always a means for capital accumulation. But it had to be to produce something to keep the cycle on. Now it does not have, the material production does not even have this instrumental function anymore. And this implies that labor power is losing essential significance for the accumulation of capital, as I said before. During the era of classical capitalism, labor power was the basic commodity of capital accumulation, because it was the only commodity whose use value consisted in producing more value than the cost of its own regeneration. For the sellers of the labor power commodity, this special position meant, on the one hand, having to serve capital every day and submitting to the compulsion of commodity production. They had to go to work and sell their labor power and work under the condition imposed by capital production. On the other hand, it gave them a relatively strong negotiation position with respect to capital, allowing them to establish significant improvements in pay, working conditions and social protections, at least in the capitalist sentence. Moreover, the specific conditions of production of standardized mass labor, particularly for this era, facilitated a broad union organizing. But with the end of the classical capitalism, this constellation of the relative balance of power between capital and labor has fallen apart completely. Automation of production and the establishment of a new transnational division of labor, known as globalization, were not the only things that have significantly weakened labor sellers' negotiation position since the 1970s and 80s. The regulation and flexibilization of working conditions and the targeted weakening of the unions through neoliberal policies also contributed. But what was decisive for the long-term and sustained change in power relations between capital and labor was the fact that the focal point of capital accumulation shifted from the exploitation of labor power and commodity production to the financial markets. As a result, the labor power commodity lost its status as the basic commodity and became a dependent variable on the dynamics of fictitious capital. This is because even the accumulation of fictitious capital, why is labor power dependent on fictitious capital? Fictitious capital can never completely decouple itself from the production of goods, as I said. Its relationship to this sector is different from that it was under in the classical capitalism. In the era of inverse capitalism, as I said previously, activity in the real economy only fulfills one function for capital accumulation. It can provide hope for future expectations for future profits. Growth or hope for growth in particular regions or sectors is a starting point for the creation of new financial titles, and as such gives impulses for the accumulation of capital at the financial markets. But at the same time, the activity in the real economy fundamentally and structurally depends on the constant influx of fictitious capital. This applies to the consumption of goods, services that are paid with revenues and credits from the financial sectors, but also investments in industry, raw materials and construction industry. Those investments can only happen while financial market dynamics remain in motion. In all these cases, labor power is set in motion, but it is completely dependent upon the economic conditions of fictitious capital. A good example is housing. People buy a house, buy credits, and this house has to be constructed. Labor power is needed to construct this house, but it depends on the future expectations on that this credit will be paid back and that the price of the house will rise and all these things. Thus, fundamentally, in the era of inverse capitalism, material production only happens to the extent that it is directly or indirectly induced through the accumulation of fictitious capital. The real economic sector will boom only as long as it is fed by money produced in the financial sector. Money which by this way simultaneously creates new reference points for the continuation of its own dynamics. So this is a circle, but it's different. It's a different circle than in the classical capitalism. If this circle is broken for one reason or another, it immediately leads to a strong reversal in the spiral motion of accumulation, causing a massive devaluation of financial titles with immediate repercussions on activity in the real economy. This relationship between financial economy and real economy is particularly direct in the construction industry because speculation on rising real estate prices is directly connected to the construction of buildings and the expansion of infrastructure. Moreover, the construction sector is always relatively labor intensive because it cannot be automated to the same extent as industrial production. In every boom region, it is therefore the biggest purchaser of labor power and has turned to be the greatest single position in GDP statistics. But for the same reason, the construction sector is also particularly susceptible to the crisis of fictitious capital, as the crisis of 2008 has most recently shown. Well, but it's not only the industrial, construction sector, but also the industrial sector, which depends on the fictitious capital. Or the most strong example is the rise of China. The industrial rise of China, which is only possible because China produced for the export. And what did it import? It imported things, no things, but it imported financial titles. Yes. So this was the way the rise of China's industry was possible. Well, let's get back to the sellers of labor power. Sellers of labor power do not only notice labor's extreme dependence on fictitious capital during the periods of acute financial crisis, but rather also during the normal course of accumulation. In particular, immense pressure is produced by high yield expectations, which are measured by profits in the financial sector and are far above the norm under the classical capitalism. In order to meet them, wage and labor conditions must be continuously pushed downward and working hours must be ruthlessly expanded. There is no site and no company that has been spread from this worldwide dumping contest. Pulling out of it is punished by withdrawal of capital, which, because its focal point is the financial sector, has become almost infinitely flexible. Even the largest transnational companies and global market players are subject to this pressure. The previous example of Siemens I gave is typical. It shows how the relationship between labor and capital has turned on its head in the era of inverse capitalism. Imagine if a global company had announced 40 years ago that it would close a perfectly viable location which gives high profit, and fire several thousand employees. 40 years ago, the shareholders would have kicked out the managers for destroying the valuation of the capital, the company's capital. I mean, obviously, also 40 years ago, there were locations closed and we had mass layoffs. But they only happened when a factory lost money over the long term and could no longer be competitive through rationalization. Ultimately, it was a matter of expanding investment opportunities for capital in the production of commodities. But this logic does not longer apply in the era of fictitious capital, because creating new accumulation opportunities for capital no longer requires the expansion of production. Instead, the important thing is the continued reproduction of financial titles, which represents claim to future value. The current profitability of a particular production location is only a superficial reference point for this process. From that perspective, average profitability no longer appears sufficient to be sufficient as the threatened Siemens locations show, because it cannot happen, it cannot keep up with the financial market's profit targets, and because it does not generate fantasies of future profit increases. That is why their closure pushes the shares of the affected company up and not down, even though it amounts to the destruction of functioning capital. Factories are closed, capital of Siemens is destroyed, and the shares go up. Why? Because it's not the functioning capital that counts, but the financial titles. The fact that the company's productive basis has been reduced is irrelevant, because the actual consequences in the real economy are secondary for the accumulation of fictitious capital. The crucial point is the creation of expectations of possibly high future profits, but that can be realized today. Although if these expectations are not met, the shares or stocks can be divested in seconds and replaced with other financial titles. Okay, I'll skip a little bit. Well, the fact that labor has become a mere appendate of fictitious capital in the era of inverse capitalism has not harmed its moral status in society in the least. On the contrary, it is precisely because labor is under increasing pressure and has lost economic significance as well as social and political negotiation power that it has massively regained relevance in the last 30 years for the construction of individual as well as collective identities. So, the degradation, the economic degradation of labor has led to that labor has more importance in society than ever before in the last 40 years. In the 1970s and the 80s, the capitalist work ethic and the identification with work as one's purpose of life came under criticism through the impact of the crisis of labor on the one hand, and in the wake of the Cultural Revolution of 1968. So in the 70s, 80s, when I was growing up, we were against this work ethic and this labor identification with labor, and this was one of the starting points for our political engagement, or for many others. We had large movements against labor in Italy, for example. But this is now the situation completely different. With a political turn towards neoliberalism, which initiated the era of inverse capitalism, an ideological change took place. Initially, it was the neoliberal elites and the neoliberal-oriented social democrats who preached a return to work ethic and consequently legitimized flexibilization and deregulation of labor relations above all, as well as clear-cutting the welfare state. But now, after the devastating social effects of these neoliberal policies became unmistakable, there was a new ideological turn. Identification with work or with labor broadly became the reference point for a regressive nationalistic critique of neoliberalism and critique of the financialization of capitalism. Populists on the right and on the left now evoke the construct of the good working people and promise to put them back in the center of society. That is apparently supposed to happen by means of a return to a market economy based on mass labor, which will be regulated by a reinforced national state and all these things. But what appears to be a radical criticism is in fact no less than a dangerous political regression. Basically, the appeal to labor is identical to an affirmation of the core of capitalist society. The historical specificity of capitalist society, we discussed it in the other forum. This historical specificity of capitalist society is constituted precisely by the fact that it places labor at the center, unlike all other previously existing societies. Because commodity production always means that social relations are mediated through labor. But this form of mediation is necessarily reified and constitutes a certain form of abstract domination which is historically specific for capitalism. People do not interact with one another directly, but rather via the products of their labor, that is their commodities, and the sale of labor power. Thus, the social relations are transformed in relations between things. The products of labor thereby gain power over their producers and exercise their reified compulsions on them. Marx called this the fetishism of commodity producing society. These fetishistic compulsions not only have an outward impact on the individuals, they also form and shape them in a fundamental way. To put it bluntly, we can say that individuals under capitalism become subjects through labor by treating all other members of society and the society as a whole as objects. They become subject means an object. So we are treating us all as objects by not communicating directly, but by mediating our relationships by labor, by commodities, and by money. So that's the basic, I would say it's the basis of the subject formation or subject constitution in capitalism. Labor is therefore intimately associated with the constitution of the modern subject. That is also why identification with one's work seems so natural and indisputable. The modern individuals are obviously not conscious about this fetishistic constitution. For them, labor at least appears to be a transhistorical constant that constitutes the essence of humanity. From this perspective, it is no surprise that criticism of capitalism is almost always accompanied by positive references to labor. That labor is at the core of human being is the creed not only of liberalism but also of traditional Marxism, whose relation to labor took on a virtual religious overtone. Marxism considered the working class to be the true subject of history and therefore the predestined era of social emancipation. According to this traditional Marxist view, emancipation essentially meant establishing a society based on universal labor, but in which there was no such thing as capital anymore. In other words, it was a matter of liberating labor from capital and not liberating humanity from labor. But this conception is a contradiction in terms. Well, from that perspective of the traditional Marxism, the great majority of the good old labor movement, from that critical perspective on traditional Marxism, the great majority of the good old labor movement was not a movement against capitalism, either, but rather a movement for labor within capitalism. As such, in its time, it essentially helped make life within the existing order a great deal more bearable and gain liberties within the existing order. Likewise, its struggles helped to keep alive the idea of social emancipation in a certain way. On the contrary, the glorification of labor in the new populism has a completely different character. In the old labor movement, identification with work was a reference point for practical struggles for social recognition I need 2 more minutes. Well, in the old labor movement, identification with work was the reference point for practical struggles for social recognition, improvement of working and living conditions, and political participation. The new populism, by contrast, represents a reaction to the fundamental degradation of labor by the dynamics of capitalist crisis, and is driven by the nostalgic desire to return to a long gone era of capitalism. In that sense, labor populism today, both in its right and left-wing variants, is in the strict sense of the word regressive. The fact that a return to an earlier state of capitalism is impossible does not make it any less dangerous. That there is no way back is precisely what makes populist politics to become increasingly aggressive in an unpredictable way. Just think of Trump. The tendency towards nationalist petitioning is intensifying worldwide. At the same time, the authoritarianism is advancing. Wherever the new populists come to power, they systematically dismantle the liberal democratic constitutional state, as we all know. So today, the fight against this political regression is the paramount task of anyone who still holds onto the possibility of an emancipated society. But that struggle can only be won with an intensified critique of capitalism. The fact that it draws on widespread unease with capitalism, this populism is based on a widespread unease with capitalism, is not the least of the reasons why authoritarian populism from the right or the left is so successful. But even if this unease points towards a vague awareness that capitalist society has reached its limits, it is being channeled primarily into the desperate desire to preserve the existing social order against the dynamics of its own crisis. This appeal to labor as a pillar of identity is a central motif in this. But since the honor of labor in the traditional sense can no longer be kept up, what remains of that identity is only the contribution to social and racist exclusion and nationalist delineation. A well-grounded critique of labor, I come to the end, last point, as the central principle of capitalist society is therefore not an intellectual make-work project, but rather a crucial project for opening up a new perspective for social emancipation. The abolition of labor is in no way an utopian idea. Capitalism has been abolishing labor in a negative sense for a long time away. On the one hand, it has largely made it superfluous through the productive power of knowledge, and on the other, it has degraded it to a mere appendage of the accumulation of fictitious capital. It would be only possible to regress to a point behind this stage of capitalism through a social disaster. In contrast, it is necessary to use the enormous productive potential that capitalism has created to finally make a good life possible for the entire world. But that cannot happen without a fundamental social transformation.